What's up, guys? It's Rey-Jay back with another video. And in this one, I wanted to break down what's happening with SPY, Tesla, and the overall market. I'm going to break down what's going on with the economic calendar moving forward and break down other factors out there. But just note that I am not a financial planner, so take nothing I say as financial advice whatsoever. And also, if you guys can, please check out my Moomoo link. If you deposit $100, you're guaranteed 5 free stocks. If you deposit $2,000, you're guaranteed 30 in total. And the offer ends very soon at the end of March. Anyways, as far as the market is going, we've entered this all-time high level, which is what I was talking about in my previous videos. We were correct about this prediction. I said that as long as SPY can hold above 600, we're looking for the all-time high. We also mentioned there was a breakout right over here, and after Trump's inauguration, we were expecting the market to continue to push. So my prediction was 100% correct about us getting close to, if not, reaching all-time highs. And now the question is, what's going to happen from this point on? So I do want to say that despite the fact that we hit this all-time high area, there's a very, very tough resistance up there. And historically, there's a very, very big chop zone for SPY. So there's a very good chance that we're not just going to shoot past this all-time high, even though I would love to see that. It's not a guarantee. And we do have a lot of gaps to fill below. So it makes me a little bit concerned about the possibility of us turning just a bit to cool off on many of these different indicators. And I find that to be very, very probable. So I'll talk about the specific levels in just a couple of minutes. I first want to talk about some data. Just know that when you look at the market today, we didn't even have a solid green day. A lot of stocks were actually in the red. If you look at the finance sector, if you look at like health technology and many others out there like utilities, we saw a lot of red today. Okay. There were some stocks in the green, especially big tech like Amzn, Microsoft, even Nvidia, but most stocks were actually more flat, if not in the red. Despite that, big tech is what held the market up. That's why we saw SPY, the S&P 500, ES, Nvidia, NQ, the majority of these in the green. So I'll break down more information about this in just a couple of minutes. Just know that tomorrow is going to be Thursday, January 23rd, 2025. At 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, an hour before the stock market opens, we have initial jobless claims coming out, jobless claims for the 4-week average and other factors out there. Then we also have some bill auctions at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we'll have to see what happens at least moving forward for all of this. There's nothing else that's too significant that's coming out, but just know that this may cause some volatility, at least for the American markets in the morning. And then as far as earnings go, just know that yesterday was a killer earnings from Netflix. They absolutely crushed it, breaking all-time highs. Today, we just had minor earnings like P&G and Johnson & Johnson. I already went over these in my morning video. And then we just got Discover coming out for today, so this was a little bit minor. Tomorrow, we have American Airlines and GE Aerospace, but everything else is more minor for the time being. As far as Discover goes, just know that they beat on EPS for Q4 of 2024 with $5.11 above expectations. Revenue was at $4.76 billion above expectations. Net income was quite good with a nice increase year over year. And their total loans are also down just a little bit. Despite that, they did see more profitability. I also want to add that with the growth that came, we're expecting some decent growth, at least for the first quarter of 2025. So let's just hope that this continues, if anything. And I think that we got some good news, at least right now. There's also a potential merger that could be coming with Capital One. We'll see if that ends up being the case, but for now, we're going to be watching some different factors. I also want to add that Tesla and many big tech stocks could be announcing earnings for next week. Tesla should be posting their earnings on the 29th of January, 1 week from now, alongside other big tech stocks. So next week is going to be big for earnings. Just keep that in mind. The last thing is this. Right now, there is still some fear in the markets. We're very close to neutral. We'll see what kind of shift we get. But I'm going to be very careful with this. Momentum is also neutral as the market's bouncing off its 125 daily moving average. There is still a lot of buyers who are returning and trying to help the markets. And then we also have the put to call option ratio rejecting here. When we do see these big drops like this is a sign that a lot of these puts are being closed. Lots of shorts got squeezed, and we have to be a little bit careful with this. Volatility for the VIX also has been dipping a bit, but right now we're trying to hold support. So we'll see if the VIX gets some kind of bounce or not. But overall, we have to be very, very careful. Now, let's talk about the technicals and why I'm a little bit concerned about this. So it's awesome, very, very awesome that SPY has been pumping. But notice that we were at this low here. We gapped up, pushed higher, we gapped up, pushed higher, gapped up, pushed a little bit more, and gapped up. We're just gapping up over and over and over and over again. And the issue with doing that is there's a lot of liquidity that's being drawn away from these particular levels. And these levels will be acting as magnets if we break some key levels. So you want to be very careful. On the daily chart, we're near the all-time high, and this tends to be a tough resistance for SPY. Hypothetically, if we break 608 on SPY, we're looking for the 610s. And if we can't do that, if we don't break past 608, there's going to be a risk of us coming back down to fill this gap at the very least. And if we don't hold that, we could dip even lower, but there is that big gap to fill around 603. My concern for SPY is this: when you look at the 4 hour, we pumped and we got a small rejection here. We also start to sell off a little bit more in the after hours, which makes me a little bit concerned. So I think that we're in a chop zone right now. I was saying this since the last couple of days that we will push more close to 608 and expect some chop in this area. But I think that we do have a gap to fill, so I'm a little bit more concerned about that. What I think is this: you guys know my bullish case. If we break 608, we could be pushing more. If we end up failing to hold 606, I think there's going to be a risk of us returning back down to 603 to fill that gap. And I favor that a little bit more looking at this setup. So heading into tomorrow, they could grab liquidity, consolidate a bit, and then there could be a risk of us coming down towards that like 603 area, if not below, to fill that gap. And then once that gap fills, we'll have to see if we get some kind of bounce off this area right here. So we have previous resistance becoming support near 602. Will we bounce again and try to continue to go higher? Do we lose that? I think there might be a small pullback to the 602 to 603 area, and we'll see if we bounce or not. For now, we're just going to take this one step at a time. So watch your levels just to be safe, but just know that I am leaning a bit more in the favor of that potentially happening. On the QQQ, exact same setup. So we got this nice breakout. We already ran so much, very close to all-time highs. I called out yesterday 533 and 535 to be watched. Notice that we hit 533, but we weren't able to crack past that. We actually got a rejection, but there's no confirmation that's a big rejection yet. Now, when you look at the daily chart, we're forming a big wick right over here. If we end up losing support right here around this 530 area, we could be dipping down to fill this gap all the way down to these lower levels. The pre-market gap is actually at 527, and then if that fails us, we return to 525. My gut is telling me what's going to happen is this: we're watching this pre-market gap first around 527. It depends if we could hold 530 or not. We're barely holding 530. If this holds and we break 533, we're looking for 535. If 530 fails us, look for 527. If that doesn't hold, this is where we have previous resistance becoming support. So right here, if that does not hold, we dip all the way down to about 525 for a small pullback. Then we'll see if we bounce between 527 and 525. So I anticipate the most likely possibilities we dip like this into this range between 525 and 527. And we'll see if we bounce or not off of that to break towards all-time highs. We'll see about that if we dip and bounce or if we just continue to fall. So it's going to be dependent on if we get a bounce or not off that support down here. But I favor we might be dipping a little bit more. Another thing that's interesting is the Russell 2000 already got a rejection. So this was pushing very nicely, came very close to my target. I was talking about 230, and I said if that broke, we're looking for about 233. But then I did warn you guys that I've seen some weakness yesterday, and that's already starting to perpetuate. So we have this big gap down here around this 225 area. So tomorrow, if we do get some kind of rebound and we reject, we need to try to hold above 230. If we don't break past 230, there's going to be a risk of us coming back down to fill this gap towards 225. So watch to see what happens at least from here. For other factors out there, we have ES. ES got this rejection right here. We were supposed to hold above 61.25. If we can't hold that, we could be dipping a little bit lower. I do want to mention that we have this previous resistance becoming support at 6100, which I think we're going to be revisiting. So I think that because we're rejecting here off this very, very key zone here, previous resistance or previous support becoming resistance, that is favoring a move back down to about 6100. We have to see if we hold that or not. If we hold this, we could attempt to rebound. If not, we could be dipping to about 6080 or so. So I favor a small little dip to about 6100 and then 6080, and we'll see if we bounce or not. NQ is very, very dependent on this key level at 22,000 flat. If we break 22,000, hold above it tomorrow, yeah, we could continue to go to 22,200, right? If we don't break above 22,000 and we fail to hold above it tomorrow, there's going to be a risk of us returning to come back down to where this gap is, also returning to our 20 EMA around the 21,800 area. So please keep that in mind, guys. I'll be watching that very, very closely. I am favoring that it's actually showing a little bit of weakness here. It's not holding above 22,000 so far, which opens the doors for a little bit of a dip here. So you want to be very, very careful. Notice on Bitcoin, we pumped very nicely, but there is a possible left shoulder, head and right shoulder here. And regardless of that, we are going to likely be approaching 102,500 to see if that holds or not. If it doesn't hold, we could be tipping all the way down to 100,000. So you want to be very careful with this head and shoulders and just know there's a lot of weakness right over here, at least as time develops. For other factors out here, I want to say that Nvidia is looking like it could be forming kind of like a cup and handle. But that depends if we could try to break past 147.5. So we're essentially watching 147.5. If we break past that, we could be pushing for 150. If we can't, we could be dipping closer to 144 and eventually back down to 140 in that range. So watch 144. If that fails us, we're looking for 140. But then even if we do get some kind of dip like this on Nvidia, we could continue to pump with this cup and handle like structure. So be a little bit careful with Nvidia. If we do get some kind of dip back down to about 144 to 140, then we could bounce very, very nicely. If we hold above 147, we're looking for 150. If we can't, we're looking for 144 and then 140. Hopefully we hold support and try to bounce. I'm a little concerned about Tesla because we're barely holding support. Remember, I was calling out this blue trend line. This was the support since October. And instead of holding it and bouncing and bouncing and bouncing and bouncing and bouncing and continuing to uptrend for 450 now, what's happening is Tesla is just barely at this area. It's barely at the trend line. It's not the best of signs because it's looking very heavy. Why else do I say that? Well, look at SPY. It was up 0.5%. QQQ was up 1.28%. Tesla should have been up over 2%. Instead, it's down 2%, which shows that Tesla is showing some relative weakness. It is becoming weaker compared to the markets. And I also want to call out that there's a possible, like a left shoulder here. This is like a head. And then this could be kind of like a right shoulder. And then that could be favoring a move down if we end up getting some kind of break. So I'm a little bit concerned about this. There's no confirmation of Tesla rejecting and dumping yet. If we end up losing 414, then I think Tesla could be dipping back down towards like the lower 400s. If we hold 414, we could try to bounce and slowly uptrend into the 420s. So we'll just have to see how things end up going. But I am a bit more concerned about the fact that this could be dipping back down to the low 400s. So give this some time to develop, and we'll see what ends up happening from here. So watch these levels very, very closely. There is a higher risk of this dipping now because of the fact that there is some weakness. Don't worry, guys. It's not the end of the world because Tesla has earnings next week. So we'll see about this. This big red bar in this reversal structure does typically favor downside because we had a high here, came down, made a lower high. So I'm a little bit concerned. I think this setup favors downside a bit more. So we'll see if we hold support or not, but just note that there is that risk of downside. For Apple, we're looking a little bit more promising. We saw so much downside after their Chinese sales declined, and after we got some downgrades from JP Morgan and other analysts. However, the 4 hours looking a bit more bullish. As long as we don't lose 220, we could be looking for an attempt to push towards our gap resistance at 224. And if we manage to gap above that or hold above that, we're looking for essentially 227 plus. So I think there's a good chance that we try to push for 227 or so. And if we break that, we're looking for 230. I think that there's a good chance we try to push a little bit higher, so give this some time. As long as we don't end up losing 220, we do favor somewhat of a bounce. For the rest of these tickers, we have Netflix. It was very, very bullish. It's still up 10% despite the fact that it got this little sell-off here. I think tomorrow is going to sell off a little bit more towards about 940. This is previous resistance becoming support. So we're going to be watching for a big test right here. We'll have to see if we bounce off this 940 zone or not. 936 to 940. We might be coming back down here. We'll see if we bounce or not. Look for a little bit more downside tomorrow. We'll see if we get a bounce off of that. So that's going to be very key for the way it ends up moving. So watch for a little bit more downside by about 11 points, and we'll see how it ends up reacting. For MSTR, although there's a nice inverse head and shoulders like structure's already bounced so much, we have this gap to fill down here, and we're just barely holding our 20 EMA. I suspect that it might be coming back down to where this gap area is for a small pullback towards about the 368 or so area. Then we'll see if we get a bounce or not off of that. So make sure you watch that very closely, as that's going to be very, very key for the way the share price ends up continuing to move. For Celsius, we're showing a little bit of weakness because we have this downtrend being established so far. We were supposed to hold above support, but we failed so far, and I did call this out yesterday as I saw some weakness on the chart. So we're barely holding 25. We'll see if we get some kind of rebound tomorrow to retest 25.8, and then we'll see if we get a rejection. I think it's going to rebound just a bit like this off our very, very key fib level. And then we'll see if we reject off 28.5 to 26 to continue to dip. It is showing some weakness nonetheless. For the Supermicro chart, we're looking decent. I think it might push a little bit more towards the 34s because that's where our 200 EMA happens to be. But the issue is that we were not able to break past our 200 EMA. And if we get some kind of rejection, we're going to be returning back down to 32. With this double bottom that's forming, we'll just have to see if we can try to break past 34.5 to start pumping even more towards 36. If we reject here, we could be dipping back down to 32. So look for a push and maybe a rejection as the most likely possibilities. Also, just note that with this double bottom forming, this, although it has more upside potential, there might be a temporary move down because it's struggling to hold above its 200 EMA. So it might do something like this before it tries to break out later. Might be looking for a move just like this, a little pump and a dip before it tries to bounce. For Palantir, we look bullish. It's doing a great job at holding up so far. Let's see if we could break 77.5 to continue to push for 80. I think it will eventually get there. Whether we get some kind of pullback with the market first before it tries to bounce up for 80, or if we just go straight up there, I do think it's looking very, very bullish so far. We have some big deals that were signed for it, so this could be forming a cup and handle. Looks bullish overall. I think it's doing a good job. Rivian is showing weakness. We lost our 200 EMA around that 13 area. This is favoring a move back down to 12.5, and we'll see if we bounce off that or not. But just know that there's going to be that risk of some downside. For SoFi, we got a big red bar, a big rejection. We're trying to make a potential bounce right here. So it's going to likely make a lower high here off our 0.618 retracement, which is around that zone. Before it starts coming back down to about this level right here, it's about 16.8. Might be a temporary pullback on SoFi before it tries to break out even more. So just keep that in mind. For AMD, same thing. Okay, this is starting to pull back a bit. I think that there's going to be a risk of this coming back down towards our EMAs, right over here towards 121.6. We have to hold that in and try to bounce. If we don't hold 121, though, we could be dipping back down towards like 119. So we'll see if we end up holding 121 to start rejecting or not. So watch this very, very closely if we get a rejection, a bounce or not. But I do see a little bit of downside coming by at least 2 points. For ARM is also doing a good job at pushing very, very nice breakouts. We got some bullish news involving the funding for the data centers that's been increased. This is going to be very important for powering them up to help invest and develop AI in a lot of different ways. ARM is directly involved in a lot of deals, but I just want to say that despite this, we are a little bit overbought at this 180 area. It might come down just a little bit. Right over here, testing previous resistance becoming supports around that 170 area before it tries to bounce again. Overall, it's bullish though. It's still very, very bullish. But typically when you have big days like this and you're kind of looking like this, we do come down just a bit before it tries to continue to pump. But I do anticipate it's going to be dipping just a bit more before we see some kind of big reaction. The problem I see with SoFi is the fact that, not SoFi, Coinbase, is that although we have a double bottom, we have a lot of upside potential, we're not really getting that upside yet because we're struggling to break past 300. If we break 300, we go up to about 308. If we can't break 300, we're going to be at risk of returning to about 285 or below. So we might be retesting 285 to 280 or 50 to 20 EMAs, and then we could be looking for a bounce back up towards our resistance over here. So there's a nice double bottom here. We'll see if we get a breakout or not. So watch that very, very closely, at least as time goes on. For Amazon, I see something very similar developing. We might reject here and return to the previous resistance becoming support at 232. And then we'll see if we get a bounce or not. So I'll be watching this very, very closely. Look for a small pullback to 232. If we bounce, we could be returning back up to 237. And if we lose this, we're going to be dipping back down towards pretty easily towards 230. So we'll see if 232 holds or not. I do think we're going to pull back a little bit on Amazon, and we'll see if we get a bounce or not. It could go either way depending on our news. Same thing with Meta. Meta is going to be dipping a little bit more in my opinion. So if you look at, for instance, this cup that's forming, we're rejecting so far, which makes me suspect we might be dipping a little bit more towards like 617 to 620. Then we could be forming a nice cup and handle just like that. If 617 fails, we could be dipping lower, but I think we might dip and then bounce. So give this some time to develop. For Microsoft, we did a good job at holding up so far. The only issue is that we have a very tough resistance around that 447 area. So I'm going to be looking at this zone right here. So that 442 area, so like right here. We have previous resistance becoming support. I think we might be revisiting 442, and we'll have to see if we bounce off that or not. If not, we're going to be dumping to about 440. So it's a very similar setup. It's very simple. We're going to be dipping to about this zone right here. We could bounce and then continue to push for 450. If not, we dip into like the 440 zone. So watch that very, very closely. Google is looking so-so. So the problem with Google is that we're in this shuffle zone. We have this resistance near 200, which we're struggling to break above. And then we also have the support around the 190s. It's looking like it's slowing down a little bit. I am a little concerned it might be coming down just a little bit towards like 197 to fill that gap. And then we'll see if we bounce off that or not. But we need to hold above not just 200, but break 202 to remain bullish. Because we failed to break 202, we're looking to see if 200 holds. If not, 197 could be coming before we try to get some kind of bounce. As predicted, GameStop's trying to bounce, might be retesting 28 flat at our 20 EMA. AMC looks a bit more bearish, might be tipping towards 3.3 flat. DJT is looking bearish as we predicted yesterday. It could be dipping closer to about the 32.5 area before we see some buyers to return. And then for the VIX, we're on a bit of a downtrend, uh, but it's showing some signs it's trying to base here. So there's some buyers stepping in. Will this get a big bounce right here? Will this be a sign that the market's about to see a pullback? You want to be very careful, guys. If this gets a bounce, that could be a signal. And so far, it's holding support. So we'll see about that. The 10-year is also starting to rebound just a little bit. We'll see if we break 4.63 or not. Whether or not this makes a big move depends on the Fed next week, though. So we'll see about that. And then last but not least, we also happen to have the dollar index. Is this about to bounce and push for about 108.5? If this does bounce, that could be bearish for the markets. So we'll see how it goes. The market's been pumping quite a bit, but I am seeing some signals that suggest that we might come down to fill some gaps. There might be a small pullback, but that's completely normal because the pullback could be followed by a big bounce later on. So we'll see about that. And we'll be watching our very, very key levels just to be safe. With that being said, I thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget about my Moomoo link, and I'll be back with another update tomorrow morning before the market opens. Have a good day, guys. I'll see you guys very soon in the next one, and peace out.